Okay, welcome to our first lesson in the series called Great Debates in Jewish History. Tonight's topic is the Dead Sea Scrolls and what we can learn from them. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to begin with the end in mind, because as I was studying this, I kind of got a little bit lost in the details and kind of got lost with the bigger picture. So I want to start with the end in mind, the big picture, and then be able to come back to it. So what this class is going to focus on is what was the debate going on back in the time of the First Temple era. What was the big debate in the Jewish world going on at that time? And how are we informed about that through the Dead Sea Scrolls? And there's 9 key points we want to come away with. So I want to talk about those 9 key points, and then we'll go back and go to the text from the beginning, kind of going through each one, right? So number 1, the Qumran evidence confirms that the Mishnah, the beginning of the oral Torah, preserves reliable information about the Judaism of temple times. And it reinforces the notion that the Mishnaic law was well established before the temple's destruction.
It gives us a reference on page 22 and 23 in the book.
Yes, good.
There's only 8 there. You must have a 9th one.
Yes, to page 22.
Okay.
And yes, you're right. There's only 8 there. I thought there was 9. Okay, so page 22. So we're going to, again, focusing on the evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls informs us about the establishment of the Mishnah before the end of the First Temple era. Number 2, one component of the Mishnah is the received oral Torah. And that's the part that God commanded Moses on Mount Sinai orally, and Moses then brought down and taught to the elder, to Aaron and to the Kohanim and to the sages and to the people at large. And that was the explanations and specifics that Moses received from God along with the written Torah. And it's impossible to understand the mitzvahs without the details of this received Torah. And part of example is that, we all say the Shema Yisrael prayer, and it says, and you shall bind them for a sign upon your hand and a reminder between your eyes. What? The written Torah doesn't tell us what. Could be potatoes, it doesn't say anything. So the oral Torah received from Mount Sinai, that received oral Torah is critical to really understanding the written Torah. But there's a second component of the oral Torah, which is the derived oral Torah, whereby the sages, empowered by the power of logic, guided by principles of derivation, apply the laws of the Torah to various legal questions. When something new comes up, how do we know Torah's perspective on that thing? We have to use our logic to learn out Torah based on the 13 principles of logic that the Torah enumerates. The third component of the Mishnaic is the legislated rabbinical ordinances designed to safeguard against biblical transgressions. The leaders during the Second Temple era, they sensed a period of religious weakening and invoked fences to be erected around the Torah, things to help us keep the Torah. So there were rabbinical enactments that were created to help us keep the Torah. So for example, we'll talk about biblical holidays like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Passover and Shavuos. But we'll talk about rabbinical holidays like Hanukkah and Purim that were decreed by the rabbis to help keep us on track with what Torah wants to teach us. Yes. Judy, you had a question? No? Okay.
You didn't say a word.
So we have the received oral Torah, we have the derived oral Torah, and we have the legislated rabbinical ordinances. The evidence suggests that the Dead Sea sect abandoned these 3 components of law, choosing instead to be guided by some means of continued divine inspiration, some level of called prophecy. The sages taught that halakhic rulings may not be reached by prophecy or divine inspiration. Prophets can give their prophecy, but halacha, Jewish law, cannot be derived by prophecy. It has to be from the oral law, from the written law, and derived by the principles of their approved principles for deriving from the Mishnah. And that's an important part of what we're going to walk away with. And that was the big debate going on that we're really talking about. In the sectarian approach, human creativity played no role in the realm of Torah. But the sages taught that human beings must lend their creative thinking to the development of Torah, that's part of our responsibility. One of the commandments is to know the Lord your God. You have to study that. You have to learn it. And then you have to be able to derive things from that. So we very much are a part of that. In fact, we talk about the whole concept of tikkun olam, of fixing the world, of our responsibility being part of the world. This is where it comes in, is to use human logic to understand current responsibilities. Number 7, the world was created in order to allow for the harmonization of the creator with the created. The goal is not to find God by eschewing our own personality, nor to be physical creatures with no spirituality. Physical creatures and their personalities ought to express God and his ideals. The way we live Torah and mitzvahs is the expression of God in the world. And this is accomplished when we intellectually strive to faithfully apply the Torah, following the principles of derivation, to address new circumstances or unanswered questions. We are meant to be involved in this. Number 8, the survival of the Jews hinges on their attachment to Torah, the holistic system of the written Torah, the received Torah, the derived, and the legislated. And that's going to be the bottom line of this big debate. Is it all about prophecy and divine inspiration, or are we meant to get entangled with the logic of this and understand from there? So that's what we really want to walk away from our discussions this evening. Okay, so let's go. We're going to go back to the beginning here. And let's start before text 1a, before we get to there. Let's talk about the background. So 1947, 4 days before the UN would vote for the partition plan to grant Israel statehood, the Arab-Israeli tensions were growing. War was on the verge of erupting. And it's important to know that part because when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have to think about the environment that was currently going on in the world at the time. An ancient Hebrew manuscript was discovered. And it's interesting because from the time that it was discovered, it took a considerable amount of time for it to actually be accessible. So the name Elazar Sokolnik, Elazar Sokolnik, he was the father of Yigal Yadin, a noted archaeologist in his own right, and he was the second chief of staff for the IDF. So he was at the Hebrew University, and he met with an Armenian antiquities dealer on the other side of the barricade. And he was shown a fragment of Hebrew script, and he was very curious. And this led to a whole series of how to actually get access and what are these Bedouin shepherds that actually discovered the scrolls in caves, and some of them were pulled out, but there were thousands of fragments found over the next 10 years from this area. And those fragments pulled together were then able to be studied. Now, there were fragments, so we didn't have all of it. Certain things had to be interpreted from it. But Jewish scrolls from the times of the second Beis Hamikdash era, the time of the Second Temple era, this is what it showed. and many of them were copies of the Torah and Nevi'im and Kesuvim. Clearly, they were Jewish scrolls written and copied by Jews for Jews. Archaeologists have dated these, the oldest of these scrolls, to be 3rd century before the Common Era, and the youngest of those to be within the 1st century of the Common Era. But accordingly, the Dead Sea Scrolls was a cache of Jewish materials from the times before the Second Temple, and very valuable to share us with some insights. And one of the things that we learned from these scrolls was that this group of Jews, who are they? What was their lifestyle like? What were their thoughts? What were their beliefs? And how are they different from others? And that's part of what we're going to be diving into here. So the concept we want to talk about in the whole series that we're embarking upon is that, by and large, the Jewish people seek peace. We're not, by nature, I'm going to say this in a funny way, but we're not by nature an argumentative people, but we argue all the time. But
I don't know. I think Hashem had a different take on that. He did say we were stiff-necked.
Well, that too.
People.
Yeah.
But arguing is good so long as you argue with your words and not your fists.
Yeah.
Yeah, we argue. We're a people of arguing for peace, not for war.
Absolutely. And that's the idea, is that we want to stay together, but at the same time, we want to understand. And one of the unique parts about Jewish debate is always, by and large, our debates are there to seek better understanding, to advance our understanding, to advance knowledge. And that's why we debate, to seek a greater understanding of things. There's a Talmud Bavli and there's a Talmud Yerushalmi. There's a Talmud that was written in the Babylonian era, and there was a time was written about a Talmud that was written in Jerusalem, in Israel, during a holier time. And the Talmud Yerushalmi typically goes straight to the point, whereas Talmud Bavli argues back and forth. And the reason we study Talmud Bavli is because we learn more from that. We learn more from trying to, the argument going back and forth of what is and what isn't the point, than by going direct. So that's the primary thing here, is that we want to be looking into that one. So the great debates of Jewish history, we're going to be looking at 6 pivotal debates that engulf the Jewish people at different periods of our history. We'll be examining the background, the motives, the ideologies, and key events, and the aftermath of each of these flare-ups in the Jewish world. We will seek out the underlying ideologies that led to each clash. We'll explore the debates that occurred and the framework in which they occurred. And we'll study the two sides, interact with both sides, and discuss the consequences of the debate, what the debate actually sought to resolve. And we'll discover how these debates actually shaped the Jewish future in very important ways. And we'll hopefully gain a deeper understanding about the important features and the nuances of the Jewish life that we live today, based on the things we've learned from history, what to do and what not to do. So that's the goal we're going to be looking at. So let's go back to the idea of the scrolls. Many of the Dead Sea Scrolls consist of non-biblical scrolls, and these actually are the ones that teach us the most enlightening, because they provide us with a best glimpse into the thinking and the history of the authors of the scroll. So let's look at a couple of the quotes. We're on page 2, text 1A. So, and again, this is a sampling from the Dead Sea Scroll texts, right? So, woe to the city of blood. It is all lies and full of robbery. Its interpretation concerns the city of Ephraim, the seekers of falsehood at the end of days, who go by falsehoods and lies. So we see already that this text from one of the Dead Sea Scrolls is accusing inflammatory concepts, right? And so who are they talking to? What are they arguing about? Why are they feeling so strongly? The second text, its interpretation concerns those who led Ephraim astray, in whose teachings is their falsehood, and whose lying tongue and dishonest lips lead many astray. Their kings, officers, priests, people, and the proselytes who convert. So we're already seeing in some of the texts that there's again, an inflammatory environment here. They have separated themselves from others. We'll later find out that they've separated themselves from mainstream, but they've separated themselves from others with very strong thoughts about something. What is it that they're so strong, feeling strong about? Text number 2.
Which
Question
others?
about number 1, please.
Pardon?
One quick question, just to, as we get into this book, to look at the format. On page 2, you got text 1a,
Yep.
which is the Hebrew text, the original text, and then in quote, the quote, "Woe to the city of blood,"
Yep.
end quote. Okay, so, and then the next sentence is not a quote, right? Its interpretation concerns the city of, that's explanatory. Is that right?
So both of those are actually coming. Let me just take a note here. I believe that's correct. End of quote is the quote from the line from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then after that is the explanation of what that quote is referring to.
Okay, so on to page 3, then there is no quote. It's all just interpretation, explanation. Is that correct?
Hang on a second. No, actually, this is direct quote. This is actually from, that whole translation is from the scroll. I'm looking at the scroll and I'm looking at the Hebrew. And this is actually a direct quote. So this scroll is saying, it's taking a quote from the book of Nahum, the book of Nahum. Quotes the quote, "Woe to the city of blood, it is all lies and full of robbery." That's a quote from the book of Nahum that the Dead Sea Scroll is quoting. And the Dead Sea Scroll goes on to say, the interpretation of this quote is about the city of Ephraim, the seekers of falsehood. So that whole piece is actually a translation from the Dead Sea Scroll, but the Dead Sea Scroll is taking a quote from the book of Nahum.
Who made the interpretation?
These were the scholars that were involved in the translation of this, and they were many. There were many, and they were these were the scholars from the Israeli Antiquities Authority and from the universities that studied this.
You started out by saying that the authors, the society that created the Dead Sea Scrolls had broken away.
Yeah.
Did they break away from the power structure of the temple in Jerusalem?
They broke away from the mainstream society at large. They literally went out into a desert area away from everyone else to live on their own.
Why?
Why? And that's what we're studying. Why did they do that? And what we'll find out is they felt that the Jewish society at that time was not living according to the way they felt God intended us to do.
Was this during the time that the Romans were invading Jerusalem and taking over, or was this before that period?
This is during, I believe this is during the first temple era.
During the first, so the Romans aren't part of that.
Not yet. No.
Now, this is the, well, I'm sorry. I'm just a student here.
Go for it.
It's my understanding from what I've read that those that broke away because the priests of the temple, in their view, had become corrupted and had corrupted the religion. And they were no longer willing to tolerate that. And so they broke away from that to try to go back to what was a pure religion than the corrupt religion of the priests.
And more than just that of the priest. In other words, it wasn't, I think what's important to remember is that at that time, there wasn't, in that time and in that era, there was no secular society. Everyone was religious. The question was, how are you observing that religion? How are you faithful to God? And so it may be blamed on the priesthood and the way they're translating and interpreting things. But at the end of the day, society, they were breaking away from a society that they felt was no longer following the Torah, following God's will. And so the reason this is a valuable insight to study is because it helps us understand what was going on at the time in the place and what were they rebelling against? What was the society norm? What was the leadership norm? What was going on with the temple and the priesthood at the time? What were the sages of the time teaching that they objected to? And we're going to find that the essential point this bears down to is how do we interpret and learn and live by the Torah, which was given at Mount Sinai. And what we'll find is that as we study their texts, we will find that they felt that you needed some level of prophecy to understand what God wants, because everything is a God divine guidance. And human intellect should not be involved because humans are frail and humans make terrible mistakes, and and therefore it shouldn't go that way. It really has to be divinely inspired. So you're looking at guidance from prophets for everything, anything that comes up new that's different, how to do that. Whereas the mainstream and of society and the sages of that time, the popular sages of the time, they're teaching, no, God wants us involved in understanding and interpreting what the 5 books of Moses and the given Torah and the transmitted Torah, they want us to understand that of our own through logic and be invested in that and interpret new situations based on what we've learned from before in the Torah. And they're rejecting that idea. That is hypocrisy. And they had so much of it, so fed up with it, that they then separate themselves from the mainstream society, find a place out in the middle of the desert, and they live completely dedicated to their understanding of how things ought to be. And these scrolls are thereby informing us, why did they separate? What did they find heretical about the society, what was going on at the time? And so we see here in the very first text that they take a quote from the book of Nahum, which everyone accepts as one of the books of the prophets, right? Woe to the city of blood, it's all lies and full of robbery. And they then say in this scroll that the interpretation of this is regarding the city of Ephraim. The city of blood is the city of Ephraim. The seekers of falsehood at the end of the days who go by falsehood and lies. In other words, that the way that Torah is being taught, observance is being taught, is wrong. It's lies and falsehood, and they're very slanderous about it. Very strong in their opinions here. And so we go to,
Is it a rebellion strictly against the cities of Ephraim? Or is it a rebellion against the hierarchy that, that is running the temple?
yes, it's a rebellion against the hierarchy that's running Jewish life in the world at that time. And it's using the example of what happened in the city of Ephraim that the prophets say, that the prophet Nahum says was a disaster and a city of lies, full of lies and full of robbery. And they're blaming that on the way that Torah is being learned. I want to give my own interpretation here for just a second. And throw it, and this is my own ideas, so I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I'm just, when I'm thinking about this and translating, what does that mean for me today? When I look at America today and the upheaval in society today, to me, part of that is that, and this could start a whole nother debate we shouldn't go into, but a part of that is that when moral education has been pulled out of the school system and you can no longer say the Pledge of Allegiance in schools, and it's a separation of, and the idea is a separation of church and state. When I look back to the founding fathers, I don't think they were trying to remove faith from the system, but clearly separating them so that one faith is not in power. But they were not suggesting there shouldn't be any faith. And I think the moral digression of our society is because of that, right? So when I look here, I see that again, there was a group of people that pulled themselves aside and separated themselves from the mainstream society because they felt that the mainstream society was leading us in the wrong direction. So that's kind of a correlation I'm drawing. I can't say this is a Torah perspective, which is my ideas, but as I'm looking at it. So text 1b, again, saying that the leaders of the city of Ephraim. Now remember, this is a time when there was a separation between the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes, and the 10 tribes became the northern kingdom, and then 2 tribes became the southern kingdom, and there was a clash between the 2 kingdoms. All of this is going on, and the people of this sect are blaming this on the way that Torah is being interpreted. Page 4. And again, we continue in the description of what they're seeing, that why they're separating from the mainstream. So translation. All of these, the builders of the wall, that'll come up again later, and those who daub it with plaster have not understood. For one who takes wind and preaches falsehood preaches to them, for which reason God became angry with his entire congregation. He hated the builders of the wall. We'll find out that builders of the wall is a euphemism. He became angry with them and with all who follow them. So again, that's why they're separating. Page 5, text number 3. And you know that we have separated from the mainstream of the people and from all of their impurity and from involved in these things and from participating with them regarding these matters. So the scholarly consensus is that the scrolls reflect the thinking of one sectarian group. The evidence for this is very strong in as much as there were many parallels in content and language between different non-biblical scrolls. Moreover, whenever a scroll expresses a point of view that we know from other areas to have been a dispute during the temple time, the point of view is always the distinct view of the Dead Sea sect. And this will become clear as the lesson proceeds, as we start looking into the meaning of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But they're very clearly separating themselves. So what do we learn from these first few fragments? So we're making an assumption that these scrolls are linked to each other because of the time and place in which they were found and collected, and the commonalities between the text within them. And what emerges is a group that has separated from the mainstream because they view those in the mainstream as chasing falsehoods. This group, the Dead Sea Scroll sect, they call their opponents Ephraim, which is likely because Ephraim is the tribe of Yerovam ben Nevat. He was one of those who revolted against the Davidic dynasty, and he set up the northern kingdom. So therefore they're referring to the entire northern kingdom as the city of Ephraim. And so the term Ephraim is coming to convey that the group's opponents are not anointed and desired ones, but rather that they're troublemakers, rebels, who cause many people to follow erroneous teachings. So they're saying that those who, the northern kingdom, that they're chasing vanities, that they're making up their own thing, not Torah-based. They're outside the context of Torah is what they're suggesting. And this group refers to the mainstream as builders of the wall, which is a term to which we'll later refer, looking at further evidence. Why is that euphemism right there? But the members of this group, it seems, they separated themselves from mainstream Jewry, and they set up a community at Qumran. And we're calling them the Dead Sea sect because we found these scrolls in this area. But Qumran is the community that they were looking at. And their tone is very, very strong. Clearly, there was a great debate going on at this stage in history. And this debate is playing out in the pages of the Dead Sea Scrolls. What was the nature of the debate? What is this sect? And what is their opinion? And who are they attacking? On a side note, Yeshiva University decided to field a crew team, a rowing team. And unfortunately, they lost race after race. They practiced for hours every day, but they always came in last. The Rosh Yeshiva finally decided to send Yankel to spy on the Harvard team. And Yankel schlepped off to Cambridge and hid in the bulrushes of the Charles River, from where he carefully watched the Harvard team as they practiced. And Yankel finally returned to the yeshiva. And Yankel said, I figured out their secret. They have 8 guys rowing and only 1 guy shouting.
Right.
Oh! Welcome to the Jewish club. Anyway. So we're going to take an example for just a second, as we're going to go back into the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we're going to take an example. And the example is a Mishnah. A Mishnah. So the Mishnah is the collected. Let me back up a second. We talked about the written Torah God gave on Mount Sinai, Moses gave it, was all written down. But then there's the oral law that was given at Mount Sinai that was orally transmitted. The problem is that started being forgotten. And so therefore, even though it was supposed to be oral Torah, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, around the year 200 of the Common Era, which is a while after the Dead Sea Scrolls were actually written, he gathered together the teachings of the sages of the time and compiled them into the Mishnah. And there's also something called a brisa. A brisa is those sages of the Talmud. We recorded they said this also, but that was not included in the Mishnah. It's important when we learn that we know what's a Mishnah and what's a brisa, because the Mishnah is the things that were codified into what was the first collection of Jewish law, the Mishnah, right? So we're going to look at a Mishnah in particular. We're going to look at what the Mishnah says. We're going to look at what the Dead Sea Scrolls say. So we begin to understand one of the areas of disagreement. It's a very technical area. It's a very specific legal area. But we begin with the matter with Tumah B'Tara, because the contrast with the Dead Sea Scrolls is most striking in this instance. However, we're talking about Jewish law at the time, right? When we talk of Tumah and Tahara, purity and impurity, we're translating this into an English language, and it doesn't translate well. Purity seems to mean something in English that we're not trying to convey. Tumah and Tahara is a spiritual status. Tahor, pure, tahor means spiritually pure in a sense of not defiled with sin or contact with the dead or other areas that we will talk about as being tameh. So tahor is what we're translating as pure. Tameh is impure. But again, we're not talking about the English version of it. We're talking more about the spiritual status, okay? And in the times of the temple, this was a big part of life, because if you were supposed to be bringing a sacrifice, a korban, a sacrifice to the temple for the holidays or for a joyous occasion or a transgression that you want to reinstate your connection with God, so you wanted to bring a gift to do so, the person who brings something to the temple ground has to be tahor. He has to be spiritually pure. And so there are different ways that this spiritual impurity can be transmitted. If someone has touched a rodent or shrotzim, creepy crawly things, or has been in a cemetery, there are different levels of impurity, tumah, depending on the level. And then the question becomes, there are levels of impurity that can be transmitted. If I am tameh and I shake your hand, but my hands are dry, that doesn't make you tameh. But if either one of us, their hands are dry, are wet, there's moisture there, and I shake your hand, then you receive not the same level of tumah, of impurity that I have, but a secondary level of that impurity, which has its own rules. Again, we don't live with a lot of this today because we don't have the temple. We're not bringing sacrifices to the temple. But in that time, it was a very big piece of this. And it also affected food. It affected kosher, the food that they would eat. Because if something was not tahor, was not pure, it couldn't be eaten. So to give you an idea of how big a deal this is, there's about 12 different tractates within Mishnayos just on the category of Tumah and Tahara, purity and impurity. So in that lifetime, it was a big deal. A person can be ritually impure, but so can objects. Food can be impure, liquids, bottles, etc. And this impurity can be passed from one item to another, from one person to another. And the way that purity was fixed, ritual purity was achieved through immersion in a mikveh, a body of water that was built with specific particulars. The idea of a mikveh is that it's pure water collected directly from rainwater. So for example, a natural body of water, a large lake or an ocean that's been there for more than 7 years, that, there are certain specifications to that one, but those are purifying agents. And a person could immerse in a mikveh, natural built mikveh and be purified from the impurities. And again, we're not talking about dirt, but we're talking about a spiritual type of purity of cleanliness, right? Immersing in a mikveh to emerge from a state of ritual impurity is an ordinance whose rationale exceeds human understanding. Ritual purity has nothing to do with filth that can be washed away by water. Purity is a divine decree. And indeed, the longest shower could not work to purify someone who's impure. Only the special construction of a mikveh can accomplish this. My son in North Dakota is currently working on building a mikveh in North Dakota. There was one previously, actually, in Fargo, not in Fargo, north of was it Twin Falls? North of Fargo, I think.
Yeah, it was in Fargo downtown.
Oh, it was in Fargo, yes?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, Shakar. Thanks for pointing that one out. So they're looking at rebuilding. So part of the way when you go to build a mikveh, you have to make sure that it's straight rainwater that has not been contained before. And so there's a special way to build it. So I remember when this was done years ago, back in the 70s in Long Beach, California, and a beautiful mikveh was built. And then of course there was a drought, and it was Southern California. It's like it didn't rain, you know. We had these open conduits to collect the rainwater and bring it in. So the first time it was collected was in the pool by the mikveh, and then it didn't rain. And so there became the question of like, how do you build a mikveh when there's no rain, you know? And you can't like take buckets from the ocean and bring it in, because now you put it in a bucket, so it's contained. And through rabbinical discussion, how would they do that? So the decision was they took dozens and dozens of milk cartons, you know, the big frames that you put gallons of milk in, right? And you can't, you know, so they can't really contain a liquid, right? You can't put it because it just flows right out, right? They took that up to San Bernardino, up to the mountains, and they filled these milk cartons, these milk crates, not cartons, crates. They filled these milk crates with snow, and they packed them in the truck, and they hauled them back down to Long Beach, and they took all the snow and dumped it out into the container of the mikveh, and then it will melt, and it'll be the first time it's actually contained, would be in the mikveh itself. And the funny part is when they put it all there in the cement structure, it didn't melt. It was so well insulated.
Somebody asked me about building a mikveh in Kuwait.
Not so easy, right?
No, didn't work very well. Well, we did get a torrential downpour that washed out the roads and yeah, brought everything to a standstill. For like
but you had to be able to collect it at the moment, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Yeah. It took literally, we had to bring heaters into the mikveh to melt the snow to actually build a mikveh. But anyway, I'm off on a tangent. So the idea is that the mikveh was a very big part of it. One of the complex issues addressed in the Mishnah is determining in a given situation, there's sufficient link between one impure object and another pure object to transfer the impurity from the first object to the second object. It's obvious that if a bottle of water came into contact with a corpse, that the bottle becomes impure. And it's obvious that if we poured its water into another bottle, that the second bottle would become impure because the water from the first bottle was impure. But in some cases, the link between the first container and the second container is now a little bit more tenuous, right? Rabbinic sources and historical sources refer to the fact that there were sectarian groups amongst Jews during the temple times, and the Mishnah refers to Sadducees, Sadducees were Sadducees, in the English, Sadducees, and Batusim. So Sadducees and Batusim as two groups that had various theologies and legal disputes with the sages. The sages living in the temple time are sometimes referred to as the Pharisees or the Perushim. Perushim is like a parish, a translation of. So we're going to learn more about them as we go into this. So let's look at page 5. So this is a Mishnah. This is a Mishnah from the Pharisees, Sadducees, debate regarding issues of linkage for purity purposes. So this is what we're going to talk about. Okay, so this is from the Mishnah. Imrim Tzedekим. The Sadducees say, we complain to you Pharisees, for you regard an interrupted flow of liquid as pure. So let me describe the situation, right? If I take a pitcher that's full of water and I pour that into a glass, right? The pitcher isn't touching the glass. The glass is below. The two vessels are not touching each other, right? What happens if the pitcher is tomei? Does that transfer to the cup below, right? So the Mishnah is dealing with a case where a pure bottle, the reverse. I said that wrong. Reverse it. I understand that if I pour from a pitcher that's impure, the water's impure, and it goes down to the glass, it's impure. I got that. What about the reverse? The Mishnah is dealing with a case where a pure bottle or pitcher containing pure liquid is being poured into an impure vessel. Now, obviously, the liquid that just landed in the bucket or inside the vessel, that becomes impure because it was added to an impure vessel. But do we say that the impurity travels up the uninterrupted stream of water, thereby rendering impure the whole upper bottle and its contents? So does the impurity, so if it's an uninterrupted flow of water from the vessel it's going into, which is impure, does that impurity go up the downward stream of water and make impure the water that's still in the pitcher and the pitcher itself? What happens, right? So the answer from the Mishnah is that what remains in the pitcher and the pitcher itself remains pure. That's what the Mishnah says. It doesn't, the impurity doesn't go up, doesn't go upstream. Salmon go upstream, but not the impurity. But the Sadducees, they complained to the Pharisees about this ruling. They took the stricter position. They said that the bottle and its contents were now rendered impure. So in our day and time, it's all impure anyway, so we're not even thinking about it, right? So it's not an area we think about too much. But in that time, it was very important. So now let's go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls. We will quote now from a scroll quoted earlier, the one that said we've separated from the mainstream of the people and all their impurities. Earlier in that scroll, it deals with a number of issues for Jewish law. It is very fragmented, but what we can see through this is that we say such and such, but you say otherwise. So look inside here. Text number 5 on page 6. Concerning the uninterrupted flow of liquid, we say that they are not pure, and that these flows do not separate between the impure and the pure. For the liquid of uninterrupted flows and the liquid in the vessel are like a single liquid. So that sect is saying, no, this is attached. They both become impure. In their view, the impure bucket below renders the bottle impure because the impurity travels through the uninterrupted flow that connects them. And accordingly, we've now learned something important. That at least in this case, in Jewish law, the Dead Sea sect follows the Sadducee law. The two sides featured in the Mishnah are the same two sides found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we've made a connection here between these two. We haven't said that the Dead Sea sect, that they are the Sadducees, but in this area, they did the same thing. They follow the same area, right? Now it's like a separate piece of evidence to understand their daily practices, right? This is more, again, this is a complicated legal part of this, but let's try and understand it, right? In the book of Vayikra, in the Torah lists the dates and the laws of the Yomim Tovim, the holidays. It informs us that when is Rosh Hashanah, when is Yom Kippur, when the Passover is. These, we know the dates. They're stated in the Torah. Passover begins on the 15th day of the Hebrew month of Nisan, right? But it says, after informing us that Passover commences on the 15th of Nisan, the Torah then continues and says, Mimachras Shabbos, on the morrow of Shabbos. On the morrow of Shabbos, we are to kick off the harvest season. One of the sacrifices brought in the temple following Pesach is we bring an omer, which is a measure of barley. Barley is the first of the grains to harvest, to become ripened. And right after Passover is the season for the barley harvest. And so right after Passover, we're supposed to take an omer of barley and bring that for the next 49 days. We bring that as a sacrifice. Then comes the holiday of Shavuos, and we start bringing wheat as the flour sacrifice in the temple. Question becomes, what is Mimachas the Shabbos, the morrow of the Shabbos? What does that mean? And that's important because Shavuos doesn't happen on a particular calendar date. It's not like Rosh Hashanah on the 1st of Tishrei, or Yom Kippur on the 10th of Tishrei, or Sukkot on the 15th of Tishrei. Shavuos, the holiday of the giving of the Torah, is 50 days after Mimachras Shabbos. 49 days we bring the Omer, and then it's Shavuos. So knowing this answer is critical to when do we celebrate the holiday of Shavuos. So this is critical. Now, our sages have taught that here, Shabbos is not referring to the seventh day of the week, which we call Shabbos, but it's referring to a day of rest, which is Pesach. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Pesach, Shavuos, these days are like Shabbos in the sense that we do not do all of the activities of creation and building and things like that we usually do on weekdays. We stop doing that on Shabbos. We stop doing that on the holidays. The interpretation of our sages is Mimachras Shabbos. When do we start bringing the Omer offering? The day after the first day of Pesach. That's when we start bringing it. And you count the 49 days of bringing the Omer, and now you have Shavuos. So accordingly, we would now know when to keep the holiday of Pesach, and we'd know when, from there, we would know when to keep the holiday of Shavuos. Let's look inside the Mishnah. page 7, text number 6. The Mishnah says, residents from all cities. Oh, so let me preface. So what would happen? What happened in Pesach was on Friday. And Friday, Thursday night to Friday is Pesach. Friday night is right after Pesach. And now the obligation is go out and harvest the barley and bring the barley offering to the temple. Are we allowed to harvest on Shabbos?
Oh,
No. Cutting and winnowing and shelling and all that stuff, we're not allowed to do on Shabbos. But if Pesach came on Friday, then Friday night, Pesach is over, and we have to start bringing the korban, the barley offering, which would then require us to go out into the field Friday night and harvest and winnow and everything else involved in bringing the barley sacrifice. So the Mishnah says here that residents from all the cities that were near the location of reaping would gather together there so that the reaping would be carried out with great fanfare, a big event. This was like a community-wide event. And once night would fall and Pesach was over, the reaper would say to those who gathered, has the sun set? And they would answer affirmatively. And he would ask again, has the sun set? And they would answer affirmatively. And then he would say, so they said, yes, she's harvest. With this sickle, yes. With this sickle, yes. In this basket, yes. In this basket, yes. If it were Friday night, he would say to them, is it Shabbos? And they would say, it is Shabbos. He would say, is it Shabbos? Yes, it's Shabbos. Should I reap? Yes, you should reap. Should I reap? Yes, I should reap. He would ask these questions 3 times and they would respond affirmatively 3 times. Yes, you should reap on Shabbos to be able to fulfill the commandment of bringing the barley offering.
can I ask a question?
Yes.
I see a problem with it. I mean, is it just a problem with the way they stated the text? Because they have the question answered 2 times. You know, each question was 2 times in the text, and then it follows it by saying, yeah, it was done 3 times. So why is there only 2 times before that instead of doing it 3 times?
Wait, you lost me.
Okay,
Oh,
so
yeah, in the text, it's showing, yeah, it's not a problem. It could do it 3 times, but it's saying it was asked 3 times.
right, and so the text before that only had the questions repeated twice and
Yeah.
not 3 times.
Yeah, and there's probably something we should learn out of that, but that's not in context of what we're looking at today.
Okay,
Yeah. What was the purpose of the ritual? Because the Batusim, who used to say that the Omer was not reaped at the close of Passover, but rather actually after a full Shabbos. In other words, the sages held that Mimachas the Shabbos meant after Pesach, the first day of Pesach. But the others are saying, the Batusim are saying, no, you don't do it then. You have Pesach, you wait for Shabbos to come, and then Motzei Shabbos, Saturday night, that's when you go out and harvest. Which means that they're not going to be celebrating Shavuos on the same day that we are. They're not going to be bringing sacrifices to the temple ground the same day that we are. The way they interpret this word literally changes the observance of the commandment to bring the barley offering, and 49 days later when to celebrate Shavuos.
Doesn't Shavuos start 49 days after the end of Pesach? Not 49 days after the harvest starts?
So Shavuos begins 49 days after the first day of Passover. We start counting the Omer
Okay.
that first night after the first night of Passover. We get more confused here in Golis because we have 2 days of Passover the first day.
But the counting starts regardless of what day that starts on. It could be Shabbos, could not.
Right. The
The
counting
count is the
begins.
same. And so why would it affect the celebration of Shavuos?
We in our day, we're just counting, and we're counting the days from Passover to Shavuos.
What
And
has,
those,
what has the Sabbath got to do with that?
oh, when do you start counting?
You said from the first day of Passover.
The language in the Chumash, the language in the Torah, is mimachras Shabbos, after the Shabbos. Our sages interpret this time when the Torah says Shabbos, it's referring to Yom Tov. But the Batusim, they say, no, it's not. It's talking about Shabbos, really Shabbos.
So
Which means-
doesn't the Batusim have an argument, if you were to think about it logically, which we're not supposed to, but anyway, if you think about it logically, if it were really based, if Shabbos was the first day of the holiday, why was it not stated when all the holidays are stated as dates, within the month? If it's always going to occur 49 days after, you don't, they could tell you exactly what date that you should be starting Shavuos on. But instead of referring to a date, which when Pesach starts, so when the counting starts, they can give you an actual date in the next month of when Shavuos should start. But instead it says count from the Shabbos.
In our lives, we are so used to using a calendar and knowing what the dates are in advance. But that calendar was created during the Second Temple, after the Second Temple era, by the men of the Second Temple era, the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly. Before that calendar was created by Eliezer HaSefer. Before that calendar was created by Ezra Sefer, the dates were established depending on the sighting of the moon.
Okay.
So when you had witnesses that came to the temple and verified they saw the new moon, that's when the month of Sivan begins. But that doesn't change when the day of the holiday. The holiday is 49 days after Passover begins. Regardless of when the new moon, it could be the 5th of Sivan, it could be the 6th of Sivan, it could be the 7th of Sivan. Depending on the new moon is sighted. We're so used to having a calendar, we don't think about it. But back then, it was based, the new moon, the new month began on the testimony of witnesses. Right? So now it's critical to know, does the counting of the Omer, and hence 49 days later, when the holiday of Shavuos, when does that begin? Is it right after the first day of Yom Tov, Passover? Or is it after Passover, the next Shabbos, and then Saturday night we start? When does that begin? And here we see that the sages said Shabbos means the holiday of Passover, and the Batusim said, no, it's the Saturday after, right? So our question is, where did the Dead Sea Sectarians stand on this issue? How did they number the calendars in the Dead Sea Scrolls? But the scrolls are quite fragmented. But piecing things together, we see, look at page number 8, text number 7. This is from the Dead Sea Scrolls, from the Qumran calendar. In one of the texts is the Qumran calendar. On the 3rd day in the week of the sons of Mazian falls the Passover. On the 1st day in Idea falls the waving of the Omer. On the 50th day in Sion falls the second Passover. On the 1st day of Yeshua falls the festival of weeks. So what are these names? What is Mazoiha? What is Yediyah? And what is Shoyrim? And Yeshua? What are these? Right? So in the biblical book Divrei Hayomim, it reports that the Kohanim were divided up into 24 groups. And these groups would alternate every week to serve in the temple in the Beis Hamikdash. In other words, Kohanim are supposed to serve in the temple. There's so many Kohanim. How do you know whose turn it is to serve in the temple? And they split it up into 24 different groups. Therefore, in the temple times, it was common to name each week by the group that would serve that week in the temple. So depending on what week, who was serving that week in the temple, everyone referred to that week based on that, who's serving in the temple that week. Kind of like what we do with Parsha, right? What is this Parshas Yisro? Is it Parshas Bishalach? What Parsha is it? We would name our week by the Parsha. They used to name the week based on which Kohanic tribe was serving in the temple that week. And these 4 names are actually 4 of the names of the 24 priestly groups that's listed in Divrei Hayomim. So what do we learn from this? We learn that the Omer was not brought the day following the first day of Passover, but rather it was brought on Saturday night and the first Sunday after Shavuos. That's when it was started. So we see that the Dead Sea sect follows the Batusi Sadducee law in this area. Okay. Based on what we've seen so far.
Todd, could you repeat that last part again?
Yeah. So,
how are they going according to the Batusim?
So we see from the Dead Sea Scrolls, based on when they talk about when the Passover and when the Shavuos holiday begins and when the Omer begins, they're making reference to the Kohanim who are serving at that time. When you compare that to the dates of the calendar of the sages, you then see that the Dead Sea sect group followed the rule of the Batusim, that they don't start bringing the Omer until after the Shabbos, after the first day of Passover. So that's how it's following out. So it seems to be that the Dead Sea sect was related to the Tzaddikim. But were they Tzaddikim? So we learn their side of the disagreement from the scrolls, how they held, their ideas from the scrolls. And what's interesting is that you also see the flip side. You then see what the Mishnah, which was written around the year 200 of the Common Era, more than a century after the destruction of the first temple. Do we have evidence that the Mishnaic teachings actually reflected the Judaism of its time, the first temple time? Some people want to refer to the Mishnah as rabbinic Judaism, connoting the Judaism of the Mishnah is actually, God forbid, just something from the sages, not something which came up earlier. But here we see from the Dead Sea Scrolls that the way that people lived, according to the Mishnah at the time, was the way the Mishnah is written now. So when we learn Mishnah, we now have evidence through the Dead Sea Scrolls that this argument of how to live preceded the destruction of the temple. This is now how they actually lived. We now see through the Dead Sea Scrolls and their arguments, we see what was the daily lifestyle like of the people during the time of the first temple. We also see, go ahead.
Rabbi, this is not necessarily how the Jewish people lived. This was how that sect lived.
Right, but from their arguments, and compare that to the Mishnah, we can see that they chose to separate themselves from everybody else that was living that way. What is that way? The way the Mishnah actually describes.
And their interpretation, it turns out, won out.
Yes.
At least that's what carried through to today.
Yes, exactly.
Now, if there were a difference, which one of the interpretations since that's what it was the accurate will of the Lord.
And that's the debate right here. That exactly is the debate. On the head. I think you were a lawyer or something.
Now, if there were another lawyer who would really get into it.
So we've learned a good piece here. And the bottom line here is that the Dead Sea sect followed the Sadducean law. This was a primary cause for their breakaway from the mainstream. Their invective writing targeted the sages whose writings accurately depict and are faithfully linked to the Judaism of the prior centuries. So we see that we now understand from here how they were living in the times of the Mishnah, that this is how things were actually going on, and this group separated from it. And as Bob was pointing out, going forward, we see how that, that this is the way we live now. But the question still remains. We want to look at that. Well, what we want to look at now is, what's the essence of that question? What is the essence of the question they're actually debating? And why? In some senses, we have, these things are minor issues, but we see when we really look at them, sometimes they're not so minor, right? But let's talk about it for a second. We use two debates. We use the debate of the calendar, and we use the debate of purity and impurity with water carrying forward, right? It seems to be, in our mind, that the second one, the one of the calendar, has big ramifications. They're celebrating the holiday of Shavuos on a completely separate date, right? But in our initial thought, we'd say, well, that first one is not so important, but it is, because of life was lived in that time based on purity and impurity, right? But for a minute, let's take a look and say, these arguments between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? Why are they a breaking point? We talk about the arguments between Shammai and Hillel all the time, and yet we refer to both of them as being mainstream Torah. We talk about the arguments between Abaye and Rava in the Talmud all the time, and yet they're both considered mainstream halacha. What's the difference? What's the difference between when we talk about the Pharisees and the Sadducees as a versus when we talk about Shammai and Hillel? What's the difference between this, right? Next, page 11. Josephus. Josephus, for those, I just, little background on Josephus, really. Josephus was a Jewish historian. He was born about the time of Yosef and Matisyahu Kohen. He was born with the name Yosef ben Matisyahu Kohen. He changed his name to Titus Flavius Josephus in order to become a Roman citizen. His two principal works as a historian, The Jewish War and Antiquities of the Jews, both of these two antiquity books of history, they are considered primary sources in documenting Jewish history during the Second Temple period. Despite surrendering his garrison to the Romans during the Great Revolt and later accepting the Roman patronage, Josephus viewed himself as a faithful Jew. So as a historian, he was a bit of a politician too, so there's always some questions about what he wrote, how accurate are the numbers and things like that. But nevertheless, there is he's still considered one of the most useful sources of Jewish history of that era. So in his book, Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus writes, the Pharisees have passed on to the people a great many observances handed down by their fathers, which are not written down in the books of Moses. So what is this? It's not written down. Oral Torah, right? Page 11, text number 10. Maimonides, who was one of the earlier codifiers of Jewish law, who looked into all of the Mishnah and all of the Talmud and said, okay, but bottom line, this is what you do. And actually writing a first codifier of a practical Jewish law. So Maimonides, he would take all of this information and come down and say, okay, this is what we do, right? Maimonides writes in his introduction to his work, every mitzvah that God gave to Moses was given with an explanation. God would tell Moses the verse and then tell him its meaning, its explanation, and all was contained in the ingenious wording of the verse. So according to Maimonides, which is the worldwide accepted Jewish law of today even, and he was 1135 to 1204, right? But his codification of Jewish law is still honored today. And later codifiers have are basing their work on his, right? And he is saying, as a matter of Jewish law, that this is the way to go, right? That everything that God said, he wrote, and then transmitted to Moses what should happen, right? We look at text 11, page 12. In Josephus, the Jewish war, he writes down, the Pharisees are those who are considered most skillful in exacting explication of their laws and are the leading school. So Josephus is saying the leading majority, the leading school of Jewish law is the Pharisees. And they do so, exact explication of the laws. They do so by skillful logic. This is going to become a point of contention. Now, Yosef Albo, 1380 to 1444, he was a Spanish rabbi and philosopher. And he wrote a philosophical work called Sefer HaIkarim, a book of fundamentals, right? And in his book of fundamentals, Rabbi Yosef Albo says, God gave to Moses, as part of the oral Torah, pathways of derivation, hinted to in the Torah, so that the sages of each generation can exact laws relevant for new developments. And these pathways of derivation are the 13 grammatical rules that are mentioned at the beginning of the Medrash Torah's Kohanim. By using one or more of these principles, one can learn how to act in cases not addressed explicitly by the Torah. So what he's clarifying here is that there's 13 logical ways of deriving information from the Torah. If you follow those 13 principles of derivation, then anything you derive is God's Torah law brought out through the Torah. If you don't use those 13 principles, if you find some other way of interpreting, you make up your ideas, then that's not Torah. That's your own mishigas. So what they're insisting again is that logic has to be used in learning Torah, in learning how to apply Torah to our daily lives in every new generation. Logic has to be used, and there's our principles to those logic, and that's how it has to be brought out. Number 13, text 13, Mishnah, Pirkei Avos, ethics of our fathers, right? Moshe kibul Torah Sinai. Moses received the Torah from Sinai, and he gave it over to Yeshua. Yeshua gave it over to the Zekanim. The Zekanim gave it over to the Nevi'im. The Nevi'im gave it over to the men of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah. This derivation from generation to generation, this was passed down very clearly from generation to generation, what it was that Moses received on Mount Sinai as not only the written Torah, but the oral Torah that was transmitted from Moses on Mount Sinai directly from God. The Anshe Knesset Gedolah would say three things. Now this, again, we're continuing Pirkei Avos. The men of the Great Assembly would say three things: be cautious in judgment, establish many pupils, and build a fence around the Torah. So when talking about the Pharisees, Josephus referred to observances being handed down by their fathers. Centuries later, the Rambam articulated this concept by saying that every mitzvah that God gave to Moses was given with an explanation and passed down through the generations. And we call this the received oral Torah. Oral Torah, but it was received on Mount Sinai. And these oral explanations were not written down in any official way until the Mishnah was recorded by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi around the year 200 of the second of the Common Era. Why were the sages so sure about the existence of the received oral Torah? First of all, they received it from the parents, who received it from their parents in an unbroken chain all the way back to Moshe. But moreover, the evidence was also significant. When you read a book and you see a note, a superscript in the text, you know that there are notes somewhere at the foot of the page or at the end of the chapter or the end of the book. Something similar occurs when we read the written Torah. The text alludes to the existence of a received oral Torah. The written Torah alludes to an oral Torah. On the one hand, it issues many commandments and informs us that to observe them meticulously is to choose life. And these laws are not too mysterious or remote from you. But on the other hand, the vast majority of the laws are written in shorthand, often with 2 or 3 words for an entire commandment. How can the Torah tell us the mitzvahs are not too mysterious, that they are our path of life, and then not tell us how to observe them? So obviously, it must be that God supplemented the written Torah with the received oral Torah. The second leg upon which the Mishnah is founded goes back to Josephus. When Josephus talks about the Pharisees being skilled explicators of these laws, Rabbi Yosef Kalbo, he articulated this by saying that God gave to Moses pathways of derivation. So the sages of each generation could extract laws relevant for new developments. And these famous 13 hermeneutical, is that the right word? Right translation, the right pronunciation? Anyway, these 13 rules through which one can derive new laws, they're not addressed explicitly in the Torah. When the sages would use the power of logic and deduction to apply the Torah to unanswered questions, they would need to be sure they were following these rules of derivation, and that is what was pointed out by Josephus. And we call this the derived oral Torah. So we've got written Torah, we've got the given oral Torah, we have the derived oral Torah. And then the third leg of the Mishnah, the third leg of the Torah, of the oral part of it, is articulated by the famous Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. The first part of the Mishnah reports the process of transmission of the received oral Torah. We talked about first, and from Moses to Yeshua, Yeshua to the eldest, etc., to the men of the great assembly, right? They said many, so but the Pirkei Avos said that the sages said many things, but they placed extra emphasis on these 3 teachings, and they reiterated them many times because these were particularly relevant to their generation where things were falling apart, right? So what was that Mishnah said? Mishnah said, be cautious in judgment, establish many principles, many pupils, and make a fence. Make a fence around the Torah. Regarding this make a fence around the Torah, so for example, a famous example of this is, we know the Torah says, do not eat milk and meat together, right? Basar v'chalav, milk and meat. What is meat? Meat is from an animal. What do you do with fowl? Birds, what is that? So fowl, according to Torah law, the fowl, it's not meat and it's not milk. Neither. It's a different category. Like fish. Fish is a different category. It's parv. It's not milk or meat, right? What is chicken? The sages enacted a law that because fowl looks so much like animal meat and could be mistaken as animal meat, therefore, we're going to call it meat. So they enacted the idea that in order to make sure we don't break the rules of milk and meat, we're going to call fowl basar, meat. And from that point on, all fowl became considered as the same laws as any other meat. And it's not from the written Torah, but it's a fence around the Torah to protect us from wayward. I am noting that we're at the top of the hour. So I want to synopsize a couple of other really quick pieces here. Please go to page 15. Page 15. Again, we're back in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They are speakers of lies and seers of falsehood. They planned evil against me to replace your Torah, and you taught it in my heart with falsehoods to your people. So basically, what we're going to learn out here, and again, we're not going to spend much time in this, but you can certainly go back on it on your own to it. But basically, what we're saying here is that the sect of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that particular sect did not follow the rules of exegesis where you followed logical rules, 13 principles of logic in which to be able to derive new laws. They didn't follow that. They didn't follow that. Rather, they felt you had to have prophecy to answer the question. And they even make reference, and again, we don't have the time for it, but they even make reference in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls to something like a prophet. Not a prophet, because there are certain regulations to what makes a prophet, but others who were considered leaders of the time, who were able to give examples of what it should be, and they would follow those things. Whereas our sages said, no, it has to follow the legal, the logical transitions that the sages go through to link anything back to. If it can't be traceable by logic back to the written Torah, then it's not Torah. And I don't care who the guy is that comes and says it's otherwise, he wants to change something in the Torah, he's got no validity. And we don't live by that. Prophets come and they come to teach us to follow the rules more carefully, but the sectarian model was really about top down, that all the Torah was given from above and humans play no creative role in the development. And for example, that's why that go back to that rule about Shabbos, that everything, it says Shabbos, it has to be Shabbos. So what's the secret to Jewish survival? The secret to Jewish survival then comes down to being able to live our life according to the rules of the Torah as they are given to us through our sages. Let's look at page 20, text 18. If one wishes to know the secret of Jewish survival under circumstances which have obliterated larger and stronger nations, it's necessary to find the common factor or factors in all the various periods of Jewish history, which would then have to be taken as the basis of Jewish survival. I'm sure all of you have seen the article by Mark Twain, 1898, I believe, Harper's Monthly Journal, December issue, The Secret of the Jews, Jewish Survival. And Mark Twain talks, answers the question, what is the secret? It clearly says that somehow the Jews are still here, and all the others have come and gone and waved their flag and everything else, and we're still here, right? And he just leaves it with a question, what's the secret, right? Here's the answer. The answer is, if we look at Jewish history and the different sects that have fallen away over the different centuries, what happened? What was this, the guarantee of the survival of Jewish history? The factor was not language, not country, nor anything else that is often associated with nationhood and nationalism. In all these things, there have been radical changes from one period of Jewish history to another, as anyone familiar with Jewish history knows this. The single factor which has preserved our Jewish people throughout the ages, under all kinds of circumstances, has been the fulfillment of the mitzvahs in day-to-day life, like observance of Shabbos, putting on tefillin, Torah education. There have always been deviationists. The Torah itself relates that immediately after the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, there were golden calf worshipers. Similarly, throughout the period of the judges, the shoftim, throughout the period of the prophets, the period of the kings, as well as in the post-biblical period of the second Beis Hamikdash, and later, these deviationists attempted to steer another course away from traditional Judaism, but they could never take root within the Jewish people. Either these deviationists eventually realized their mistake and returned to the fold of observance of Torah mitzvahs, or they became completely assimilated among the nations of the world.
There you have it.
So I think when we walk away from this whole debate that we saw in the time of the Sadducees, the Pharisees, all the different groups, including that which we saw written in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we've learned from all of them, what we've come to understand then is that there's this debate of how do you learn Torah, what makes it valid Torah, and what's not. The bottom line comes back to, yes, we do have to engage in learning Torah. Yes, our logic is important in the understanding of how Torah is interpreted. We have to be invested in that. How do we invest ourselves in that? In learning it through 13 principles of how you will learn out from the Torah. So we have, again, we have the written Torah, and then we have three parts of the oral Torah. There's the received oral Torah, the derived oral Torah through logic, and then the fences, the legislated rabbinical ordinances. And those are three categories that help us and guide us to make sure that we stay true to the Torah. And that's the secret of the survival of the Jewish people. We see from the Dead Sea sect itself, they didn't last. They made their own interpretations. They wanted prophecy for things. That's not how it's done. History gives the answer of how we succeed and how we thrive and how we maintain our Jewish people throughout the generations. This is the answer. There's a very clear following of Jewish law. That's how we survive. There's no other means to it. Others have tried all kinds of different ways. This is what worked. Tried, true, and tested, right? Over the centuries. So I like to close off our classes with a question to each of you. What do you take away? What do you take away from the class this evening?
You know what you didn't mention? How similar what was found is to this day, the written Torah, that was the oldest copy, I believe. It's just like the written Torah today.
Yeah.
So really, that's what I take away is that, you know, our religion is still pretty much the same as it was several thousand years ago.
You put
Yes,
on the
it's
same
different.
tefillin that Moses did.
What I saw, this is serious.
You put on the same tefillin that Moses did.
Just walking in, they weren't by anybody.
I'm sorry, whoever's got the noise in the background, please mute.
Yeah, this is McGee.
So they just
We still have, but like today, the groups that are trying to twist or away from the from halacha to make the laws to suit themselves as opposed to following halacha like you're supposed to.
Mark, is there a background noise to you?
Yeah, there's people talking to them at
Oh,
the
that's why.
shop.
Okay. It was hard to hear you over that noise.
I'll go out into the hallway. Okay, I was saying that that today we have groups that are trying to twist halacha just to suit themselves, as opposed to following halacha like they're supposed to. So it's the same as it was back then.
Yeah, nothing's changed. We still have the same problem.
Yes, sir.
I read the excerpt on page 18, text 17a by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and I kind of think it's very interesting how, like from the quote unquote rabbinical perspective, it's like we are partners in God's creation in Torah with God, whereas with the Batusim, with the Dead Sea sect, they kind of were just like, in a way, blindly following Torah and not trying to derive any sort of deeper understanding, deeper meaning from it.
Yeah, and they were looking for prophets to tell them what to do and not taking any responsibility for the understanding of it and the development of it.
Yes, like that also part is very interesting, because like how often are you going to have a legitimate prophet? Like, so it required to actually understand Torah, you need to have this perspective of logic and reasoning.
And they weren't actually limited they didn't limit themselves to just prophets, because obviously they didn't have that many prophets available for them. And so they were looking for people with divine inspiration. Now, I say that in a certain mocking tone. Torah agrees with that. You know, we talk about the writings of Rashi and many of the others in that era, that they had a divine inspiration, but that's not prophecy. Prophecy is a very clear distinction from divine inspiration, but to be limited only to divine inspiration on how you should live, that's not the Torah way. That is not the way we go.
Actually, go ahead.
I have a question because of our limitation on time. On page 16, it states that 3,000 laws were forgotten during the mourning period of Moshe. Were those laws part of the oral Torah? And do they include the interpretation and understanding that Hashem would have passed to Moshe?
So the answer is yes. And the answer is that we also then turned around and gleaned more through the logical explanation of deriving things on our own. So in one sense, yes, we lost a lot, but at the same time, you know, at the end of the day, we gained that all back, but not as as direct receiving that directly orally, but rather through our interpretation of things as they come up.
So by Hashem saying that, you know, they asked about the missing ones, Yahshua, and the inquiry came back, it's not in heaven. By not in heaven, Hashem is switching the focus that, yes, I gave these to Moshe, but now it's your turn to be able to disseminate these.
Exactly. Exactly. Very good. Good.
Just one comment, and listening to all this, there are different varieties of Judaism, and I suspect most of the people in the class are Orthodox. I come from the conservative tradition, and when I was a kid, there was this belief that the Orthodox tradition was the right answer, but I don't believe that anymore. I think there's lots of ways of coming to God, and that every tradition has a different interpretation, but I don't think that the interpretations are designed to promote themselves or to make life easier for themselves. I think they come from an honest way of interpreting the Torah. And then, so, I mean, I'm a little uncomfortable when we say there's just one way of looking at things.
I hear you. I hear you. And so two thoughts. One is certainly time will tell.
Yeah.
Time will tell. And additionally, throughout the centuries, there was, this is Torah, and then there's how much we actually do it.
Yeah.
You know, none of us are perfect, and each of us is trying to do as much as we can do, and environments are more and less conducive at different times in different locations. Here in America, we have had the freedom to choose in a way that we actually have never had in years in any other time in Gullus. We've never had the freedoms that we have today. But over the centuries, you know, we look back, we've always had different levels of participation and observance. And what has happened in America is people have tried to label or differentiate their observances. But before this, we never needed to. You could have the same three people in town on completely different levels of observance, and no one was arguing.
Yeah.
You know, so I think that's where the distinction lies, is trying to separate. We never had that. You know, obviously, Jews have argued all the way back to all of this time, right?
Our tradition.
Right, exactly. And the Dead Sea sects separated themselves from everybody else and said, nope, that's not the way to do it. We're going to do it this way.
And when you said there are 3 Jews and nobody's arguing, they must not be Jews.
Wasn't the other saying there's 2 Jews on the island and there's 3 temples?
There you go. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, no, we conservative Jews, we just have a little picket fence. But Orthodox Jews like to have a electrified fence with concertina on top.
That all depends on which neighborhood you live. That might be useful.
Yeah, especially in the
But
city.
as far as labeling ourselves, I am so much of an empty vessel that I don't know that much. I consider myself an under constructionist Jew, wearing a yellow hard hat yarmulke.
Under construction, absolutely.
Yeah.
Very good, very good. And I think that we all are. We all are learning more,
Sure.
enjoying more. The lessons that we're doing through JLI for me are fascinating because I'm learning a lot as we're going through this as well.
Yep.
And I've, been at this rabbi work for, almost 40 years now. And I'm like, whoa, this is
Always learning.
fascinating,
This
That's
is
really good.
this is a wonderful book, and I've got a stack of them by now. That's about that tall. I've been doing JLI courses here with Chabad, Ilina Chabad, and Rabbi David Tartel for many years.
Very
Always
nice.
enjoyable. Always enjoyable.
Excellent, excellent. Wanted to just put a note in. So God willing, we'll have our class next week.
Mhm.
And I can't make any commitment to ending on time, but hopefully we'll start on time next week. And the topic for next week, Masada versus Yavna, divergent Jewish responses to Roman tyranny.
Be fascinating.
Fascinating discussion. When
Absolutely.
the tyranny comes, how should we respond? What does God want from us?
Yeah, I don't think Masada was a very good choice.
Next week we'll have a great conversation on that one at that time. Thank you so much for participating. Have a fantastic week, and God willing, we'll see you next week.
Very good.
Everybody have a
night,
good
y'all.
week.
All the best.
Take
Thanks
care.
so much. All the best.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right.